Okay, good morning, everyone. Here goes my first attempt at doing a mini lecture for you. The subject of this week's work is the Directory, which is the period from 1794 to 1799. I'll explain about how it got its name in a few moments. The picture you can see is a reference to the foundation of Rome. The figure that you can see is Celia, the wife of Romulus, calming the warring Roman tribes, and it's an appeal to the revolutionaries for a sort of period of calm, and I think that's what the Directory was trying to impose. We can see on the slide here Lazare Carnot, one of the first of the 5 directors, who in November 1795 became one of the leaders of the new regime, and a few key dates on the right there. I'm not going to go through them at this point. So the Directory was established in 1795 and lasted until 1799, which actually makes it the longest lasting of the revolutionary regimes. When Robespierre was executed in 1795, people were hugging each other in the streets, their joy turning almost to frenzy. Those who helped overthrow Robespierre became known as Thermidorians, and the period itself sometimes known as the Thermidorian reaction, after the month that the coup that replaced Robespierre took place in. The National Convention therefore set about dismantling the machinery of terror, getting rid, for example, of the committees of general security and public safety. And in 1795, we have for the third time a new constitution designed to guarantee the main features of the revolution of 1789. For example, the abolition of titles and peerages, individual freedoms, and the election of assemblies and officials. They wanted more than anything to ensure that a dictatorship like the CPS was impossible. So, what are the main features of the Constitution? All male taxpayers over the age of 21 can vote. Deputies will be chosen by electors, and annual elections will be held. There's a rigid separation of the legislature from the executive, in modern terms, of Parliament from the Prime Minister. The legislature had 2 chambers, the Council of 500, equivalent to our House of Commons, which could initiate legislation, and then passed it to the Council of Ancients, the equivalent of our Senate, 250 men over the age of 40 who could approve and who could object to legislation but couldn't introduce it or change it in any way. There was no property qualification for the deputies of either council, so it was a free vote for these men. The executive would be a directory, hence the name of the period, of 5 men chosen by the ancients, and would hold office for 5 years. At the end of each year, one of them would be retired and replaced. They could not be members of either council and could not initiate or veto laws. They couldn't declare war or control the treasury, and the idea here was that they could not exert the kind of influence that the Committee of Public Safety had. There were quite a few inherent weaknesses. Yearly elections promoted a kind of instability. There was no means of resolving conflicts between the legislature and the executive. The councils, if they so wished, could paralyze the Directory by refusing to pass laws. The directors could neither dissolve the councils nor veto laws. The legislature was too weak as well, and if it squabbled with the Directory, could only in fact remove one of them per year. So there was a sort of rigid separation of powers that characterized the new regime. Some major events. Let me give you just a little bit of information about some of the key ones. In 1795, the son of King Louis XVI died as a child, and therefore Louis XVI's brother declared himself Louis XVIII. This is known as the Verona Declaration, in an attempt to get support for a re-establishment of the monarchy. The Vendémiaire uprising, a large royalist crowd marched on the convention, but were very quickly dissipated by Napoleon Bonaparte, the general, who turned his artillery on them and gave them a whiff of grape shot. Grape shot being sort of small lead balls that, when fired from a cannon, spread over a huge area, inflicting the maximum amount of devastation on their target. And the fact that Napoleon was willing to do that on a crowd of his own people shows the lengths that the Directory was still willing to go to make sure that there was security and peace. In fact, the emergence of Napoleon is one of the hinge points of the revolution. His use by the Directory to resolve political disputes made him aware of how weak the system was. We have the Babeuf plot. This was perhaps the first real challenge to the Directory. Many regard Babeuf as the first communist, sort of proto-communist and influencer of people like Lenin. But his influence at the time was relatively slight. And we have the coup d'etat of Fructidor. Very tired of war by now. Support for a kind of constitutional monarchy grew, and two directors in particular, Carnot and Barthélemy, plus 53 of the Directory of the deputies from the councils, were accused of supporting a restoration of constitutional monarchy and were arrested and deported to South America. Challenges. There were lots. Members who were elected to the 500 were mostly and increasingly royalists, but were unable to influence the choice of directors. The directors themselves, Les Arcanaux, the most notable, were regicides. They were responsible for the execution of Louis XVI, so there was a conflict from the beginning. They wanted to provide a stable and liberal government, but the problems that they faced were quite daunting. War appeared to be endless, so we're talking about the war of the first coalition here, war on 5 fronts simultaneously against the combined alliance of monarchist powers that surrounded them, and this had to be paid for. The treasury was empty, taxes were unpaid, the assignat, the currency that they'd introduced, plummeted in value. So why did the Directory survive so long? Well, they were committed to restoring the rule of law. Key opponents were discredited. Nobody really wanted a return to Jacobin terror. Nobody wanted a return to the absolutism of the Ancien regime. Royalists were divided into 2 camps. The extremists supporting the Verona Declaration, and the more moderate supporting a constitutional monarchy. And the public were apathetic. There was no enthusiasm for more revolution. The main reason was support for the army. The army was what prevented challenges to authority, and this was what the Directory relied upon in order to remain in power. However, this became something of a double-edged sword. The sword that might be used to protect them could also, in theory, be used to attack them. This image here depicts the royalist uprising of Vendémiaire in 1795, and you can see the artillery firing into the crowd. I think what this image is supposed to portray is the sort of desperate lengths the Directory was willing to go to ensure that there were no challenges to its authority. So why was the Directory overthrown? In the spring of 1798, there was in fact the high point of the Republic's power. They were all but victorious in the War of the First Coalition, and there was only really Great Britain that now stood against them. But from a period of great strengths, within 18 months the Directory was finished. One of the events which prefaced this was the Law of Floreal. This law banned any elected Jacobin deputies from taking their seats in the council. This measure showed a complete contempt for the wishes of the voters and lost a lot of support for the Directory. The picture at the top there is Jean-Baptiste Jourdan, one of the most powerful generals at this time, along with Napoleon. But the law that became known as Jourdan's Law was an imposition of conscription. The army by now was down to about 270,000 men, so they drafted 230,000, but only 74,000 in fact showed up. This shows that the government was becoming increasingly unpopular. So therefore a new levée en masse was called for, and they went around the towns rounding all men aged 20 to 25, rounding them up and forcing them to join the army, which became incredibly unpopular. We have the coup of Brumaire, which was caused by a forced loan on the rich and a law of hostages, which was introduced to force the payment of a ransom of anybody who opposed the regime by kidnapping essentially their relatives and holding them and their land until they paid up. This led to a sense of lawlessness. The bottom picture there, you can see Abbé Sieyès, who was an important Roman Catholic leader, now a director, and he saw a chance for another coup. He made a plan with Bonaparte, and they agreed that power would be given to 3 consuls, Sieyès, Napoleon, and Ducos, who would then draft a new constitution. This became known as the coup of Brumaire. And the removal to St. Cloud, Sieyès planned to remove the councils out of the reach of the Jacobins. This was controversial. Napoleon addressed the 500 himself, but they were furious. There was a huge quarrel, a squabble, and in the end it was Napoleon's brother Lucien Bonaparte, who was president of the 500, who had to come to his rescue and save the coup d'etat. That's the event that you can see depicted here. Napoleon in the center of the picture, a melee all around him. He's kind of depicted here as an isolated figure surrounded by hostile opponents. But in fact, he steadied the ship at this important moment. Note the summary diagram from the reading here. You can see the key question, why was the Directory overthrown, which is one of the questions that I'll be asking you to reflect on in our meet on Friday. And around the outside, you can see there some of the key events that I've talked about. So reasons for failure. Well, there was a failure to create stability, partly due to the Constitution with their annual elections and no provision for settling disputes. You could say that the Directory was in fact doomed from the beginning. But they also made mistakes. The directors interfered with election results. During the coup of Fructidor in 1797 and Floreal in 1798, they purged the councils. They got rid of any Jacobins in the councils, and that lost them a great deal of respect because it seemed like they weren't even following their own rules. There was an increasing reliance on the army to settle disputes. This made an army takeover a possibility. The Directory's natural supporters, the wealthy, were in fact alienated by its policies, particularly by the forced loans, so they then refused to vote. An enthusiasm for war was gone. This is something of a paradox. War became a necessity in the end to ensure money for the treasury in the countries that they invaded. However, it also lost them a great deal of support. So Some might say that the regime collapsed because of internal contradictions. They favoured democracy on the one hand, but then used the military to subvert it. They needed war for economic purposes, but war lost them the support that they needed. Achievements. You can see the picture of Bonaparte here. Not sure they would see the rise of Napoleon as an achievement, but there were some. It was the longest lasting of the revolutionary regimes. Many of the achievements of the consulate, the period where Napoleon becomes first consul, began under the Directory. For example, the reorganization of the tax system helped stimulate industrial and agricultural expansion on an unprecedented scale. There were changes in administration which preempted, for example, the later role of prefects. Their dramatic solution to the economic crisis, whereby 2/3 of the national debt were converted to non-interest bonds, were an unpopular solution, particularly for those who held that debt, but that did restore the nation's finances. And then the repression of the Vendéens and Chouans, and the Treaty of Campo Formio, which ended the War of the First Coalition and left Great Britain isolated. These things did in fact help the Republic and did in fact help the bourgeois revolution to survive. Okay, that concludes the mini lecture for this week. I hope you found it helpful, and I will be alluding to this. Hopefully it helps you with your work this week, but I will be alluding to this in our meet on Friday as well and be asking questions, okay? So thank you, and I will speak to you later.